Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich talks with community leaders about issues in the public safety arena. Sponsored by River Ridge Hardware.
Well, good afternoon, morning, depends on when you're listening to the program. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. In studio with me today, I have a good friend, good partner. I really appreciate the work he's done here in the city of Spokane. Our Chief of Police, Craig Meidl. Craig, you know, we've done a lot of work over the years, and we've done a lot of outreach to the community over the years. And 2020 kind of changed that dynamic for us. It kind of broke partnerships in some respects. What have you seen since 2020 as far as our ability to reach out and actually coalesce people and get people to work towards common solutions for problems?
Yeah, 2020, you're absolutely right. That was a very challenging year at a number of different levels, right? You had things that were going on across the nation. And I think from the perspective of our officers, we really felt like we'd gained a lot of ground with community of color over the couple years prior to 2020. And then all of a sudden, all these different incidents were popping up and being attributed or somehow aligned with us here locally, even though those things didn't necessarily happen here locally. And so we felt like we had taken several steps back, and a lot of the officers were perplexed. They were frustrated, they were sad, they were disappointed. All of that was further exacerbated because with the lockdown, the ability to meet, the ability to hold these forums and have these discussions was non-existent because we had the stay-at-home orders, we weren't able to get together in groups. So the emotion that seemed to be sweeping across the nation and certainly impacted us here as well really was unchecked because of that inability to sit down and have those conversations, say, well, wait a minute, what happened here different than what was happening last year? We've made all this progress, and yet we weren't able to have those conversations. So it really, I feel like, kind of like you alluded to as well, it really sent us backwards several steps.
And one of the things that, you know, people say, well, there's Zoom. What I found is Zoom really doesn't help build relationships because you don't have that same exchange, and you don't have the ability to actually see complete body language and everything else. I mean, humans, verbal is only one part of communication. There's a whole bunch of other aspects of communication, and Zoom just doesn't catch the raw emotion of sometimes that is needed if you're going to overcome these type of discussions or problems. One of the things that we saw last fall, late last summer, was an uptick in gang violence. Now, we actually started seeing it a little bit before, but it really took off from about September of 2020, and it really hasn't ended for us. We have 5 juveniles that have been killed during that time period. More and more linkage that we're seeing on the last one may be related to some of the other earlier ones. We have a real problem going on, and you and I have talked about this during that time period, and we decided that we need to do outreach to the public and do a press conference to let the community know what was going on and try to get the community energized to, quite frankly, save our kids. I'll make it very, very clear to everybody. The reason we did this press conference is because both of us are tired of watching young people die. We are done. And that was the reason we went before the public. If we could go to our first PowerPoint. So we did this presentation on March 8th of this year. Next slide. And quite frankly, the reason we're here is gangs are increasing, and we're seeing more and more impact on our children. Next slide. And many of these shootings that we're seeing, not just the fatals, but Craig, kind of give people an idea of the drive-bys, the amount of drive-bys that we're seeing. And these are only the ones we know of, because we know that there are others that aren't being reported.
Yeah, we've had we've had over 4 times as many drive-bys this year compared to the same time last year, and these are happening all hours of the day. It used to be, you'd think, maybe at night when no one's around. A lot of these people are so brazen, they're doing it in broad daylight. We just had one recently, and we were able to get some video where they sat outside of this house for a good solid minute or two trying to get the people to come out in the middle of the daytime. And when they wouldn't, as they drove away, they fired 6 or 7 shots. Broad daylight, lots of people around. So we're having an unprecedented number of these drive-bys that are occurring. And like you said as well, those are the ones we know about. A lot of the victims are not calling in and they're not reporting. So it may be a neighbor that's a block or 2 away that reports shots fired towards the house. So we think those numbers are actually higher than what they actually are.
And when we do get them reported, we're not getting a lot of cooperation, a lot of help from people as far as who's committing these crimes, who's committing these shootings, and quite frankly, who's committing these homicides, these murders. I know it's a frustration for my detectives that are working side by side with your detectives, and I don't know how to explain that to the audience of how frustrating that is, knowing that you have people out there that are killing kids, and quite frankly, it's kids killing kids. And that's a double loss, because we have a loss of a life, and we have a loss of a life in that individual, those individuals will lose a big chunk of their life to prison. And some of the things that I'm hearing from our side is that we just cannot seem to break through that wall of silence. How about, same on your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. We're hitting the same barriers. There are dozens of people out there that know who these shooters are. They know who these people are that have killed other kids as well, and we know that. However, we are not gaining any cooperation from any of the victims, from any of the witnesses. Some of them are they express us that they're worried that if they do come forward, they're worried that they're going to be next. Some of them would rather just take care of it themselves. And so when we're there trying to stop this violence, trying to stop them from shooting each other, the very people that we are trying to protect are not necessarily coming forward with the information that we need to protect them, which I think after us trying to work different angles for several months to try to figure out who's doing this so we can get it to stop, I think we both reached that point finally where we realized we need the community to help us, because we keep hitting a wall after a wall after a wall. So we got together and decided let's ask the community for help.
Okay. Next slide. For those of you that turned in on an earlier show, you're going to see several of the same slides, but this slide shows 3 different gang sets, and these are all juveniles, and they represent 64 identified people. Next slide. This is called a peacock diagram. Each one of those dates with the green dot represents an individual. And the smaller dots clustered around that green dot is the amount of crime that is associated with that individual. And again, these are 64 people that have committed all these crimes in our area. Next slide. So the demographic, and one of the things that we stressed throughout our presentation at our press conference was this is a multi-generational, multicultural aspect. In this respect, this 64, these are the demographics for the 64 people. But Craig, you and I both know that the gang culture in Spokane is largely whites. And our reason I bring that up, folks, is Because after this presentation, after this press conference, there were some people in our community. One doctor actually wrote a letter to the editor calling the chief, both of us, racist. I received some phone calls going, you're blaming people of color for gang violence. We never once said that in our presentation, not once. And we stressed the fact that gang violence here in Spokane County, is multicultural, multi-generational. And the thing we're hearing from the older gang members is these kids that are so absorbed into this gang culture, the older generation is afraid of them, actually.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any kind of, I don't know, I guess you could almost say there is a maybe certain type of code with the older generation as well. And what I am hearing about this newer generation is they have resolved that they will either end up spending the rest of their life in prison or they are going to die. They have basically committed themselves and they have embraced the fact that that's their only two options. There is no, I'm going to move out of this lifestyle, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to get a job. It's, I'm either going to be in prison for the rest of my life or I'm going to end up being killed myself. And so, you know, what we did during the press conference, I felt was, Sir Robert Peel said, everybody in the community has a responsibility for the safety of that community. Law enforcement is the only entity that gets paid full time to give attention to that. So we all as a community, we own this. We have a role to play in this. And that was our effort to basically show the community, here's the data you're not seeing. We want to show you what we know. And then after we show you what we know, we want to ask for your help. So it was disappointing, to say the least, when we show them what the data is, and then we get accused of actually being racist. That's the furthest thing from the truth. We actually want to stop these from happening, which is why we're coming to the community with our hat in our hand saying, we need your help. We can't do this by ourselves.
Exactly. Could we go back to the slide? Now, the demographic on this, I'm going to give you some inside information, folks, today. The chief and I, when we saw this slide and we talked about this slide, we knew this slide was going to cause us some problems. It was probably going to generate exactly those phone calls, that letter to the editor, because we can't help the fact that those demographics reflect what they reflect. You have 75% are juveniles doing this. You have 75% of the demographic is male. I will tell you that 25% female, that is shockingly high, because normally, you know as well as I do, females aren't generally into the violent type of crime, but we're seeing a large increase in young females being involved in this type of crime.
Yeah.
And the other demographic is as it is. 78% of the individuals causing this problem are African American. But here's the piece that everybody forgets, and all those people that want to throw rocks forget also. Up to this presentation point, 100% of the victims have been African American.
Yeah.
100%.
Absolutely.
Now that's fatal shootings. There's been non-fatal shootings that we have other demographics involved, but the fatal shootings are African American. And I really find it strange that we live in a world that when you and I step up and say we need to stop the death of these kids, suddenly race gets thrown into there. And folks, I'm going to tell you right now, you cannot continue to call everything racist, because you are giving true racists a break, because it's easy for them to go, well, you don't agree with my opinion, so you called me that. There are true white supremacists out there. The chief and I know them. We have worked against them. We have fought against them. You had a detective last year that was under a death threat because of the work that he did to put white supremacists in prison that had done some very bad things in our community or planned to do bad things. I get so tired of hearing that rhetoric because it'd been a lot easier for us to just continue to do the work and not step up and throw ourselves out there. But folks, anytime a kid's dying, this entire community loses. We're losing generations because of stupidity. And I'm going to call it as I see it. This is just stupidity anymore. We need to do something, and we need to do rapidly to heal our community and to save these kids' lives. You and I have talked about the frustration that we feel about those aspects, and you know, I know your passion for what this means. So I'll let you dive into a little bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the important thing is we are not here indicting an entire demographic. That's not why we're here. You know, we're here to say that there is a small subset that the data is showing that is causing these deaths. We have tried for months and months to intervene, to stop these shootings from occurring. We are not able to accomplish that because we're not getting the cooperation that we need. And so we are going to show you this data. And again, to be clear, there's a small subset that is causing this. I, as a white police officer, I can't go into their homes and convince them, stop this behavior, stop this nonsense. If you know who's involved, you need to work with the police on that. That's why we went to the community to begin with. And so when we're showing them this data, it's not an indictment by any means on any one demographic. It is a request, almost a plea for help. Please help us stop these shootings because we've been trying for months and months and we just can't do it. So we'll continue to do what we do. We'll continue to try to stop these. We would be much more effective if we were able to get a level of cooperation from the very community that we're trying to save as well.
I agree. And I've said this multiple times, and those who have watched my programming for several years, I can't believe how long I've been doing this now, 12 years. We as a society are to blame here, folks, because we allowed a violent culture, the gang culture, to be moved into pop culture, and it is glamorized, it has been legitimized, and now you have kids portraying that lifestyle. I mean, this is like watching a very old gang film back in the 80s and 90s about people, you know, rap music, you know, flying back and forth as far as insults and things like that. We did this. Society did this. And it's time for us to say, no, cultures of violence are not okay. Cultures of violence, any culture that demeans another culture is not okay. And the gang culture, they do that. All you have to do is listen to the music, folks. It says it all. Next slide. Again, I want to point out that the assaults, all those assaults are felony level. Those aren't minor assaults, those are felony level assaults. And again, we have 2 murder, manslaughter charges, or 4 of them, that are associated with this violence. Next slide. So there we are. For the entire region and all the homicides that happened in 2020 all the way to February of 2021, 12% of them involved juveniles. Either juveniles dying or juveniles committing these crimes. Next slide. Let's go to the next one. So that was it. That was our presentation. And the feedback we got was not what we really expected. But there have been people that have reached out to us. You know, Phil Tyler and you and I and a core group of people that he brought to the table met last week. We'll be meeting again in the future. And the goal is simply this, to stop this violence. And I truly believe that people at that table were committed to doing that.
I agree. I think they're doing it with the best of intentions, and their heart is in it. They're not looking for any recognition. They're not looking for anything other than we want to be a part of the solution, and we are willing to do whatever it takes. We will meet with you any time of the day. We will meet with you on the weekends. We want to work to stop this, and that is exactly what we had hoped we would get out of this. So we really appreciate those that have come forward and said, we want to work with you on this. They're going to be instrumental in helping us move forward.
They will be. And, you know, even they, during that conversation, said, you know, but there are certain people we won't involve because all they want to do is throw rocks. You and I tried to talk to some of those folks that like to throw rocks, and it didn't go very well. And, you know, I agree with Phil at this time, because last time I was warned, Sheriff, don't go talking to those folks because they don't come with any solutions. They don't have any solutions. They will just throw rocks. Well, we're done with people doing that. We're looking for people that really want to solve these problems and find these solutions. Let's go back to the slides real quick and scroll through these real quick. I'll tell you when to stop. All right. Chief, you had a report that came out about a month ago. The company that did the report for you just gave us our rough draft of our report this week, yesterday actually. We're going through that report. It's very similar to what you saw, but I'm going to turn over the remainder of the program for you to go through the report and you know why you had it done and what you saw. We have about 4 minutes left.
All right, thank you very much, Sheriff. I appreciate it. So last summer, after having several officers come to me and talk about prior studies that we had done that show disproportionality in our contacts with community of color, they were truly stumped and they were concerned because they truly felt in their heart, we are not targeting any group. We are responding to calls. We are responding to descriptions of suspects and calls. So they said, we don't know what this issue is. We don't know why this is happening. So I knew of Bob Scales, who worked for Police Strategies. He did the Ombudsman Use of Force dashboard here in Spokane. So I knew he already had a lot of data. I knew that the civilian oversight had been using him as a company. So I called him and I explained to him that, you know, we've had this study that shows disproportionality in contacts, but it only is scratching the surface. It's not really getting down deep into some multiple layers of what is actually occurring within the city of Spokane. So I asked if he would be willing to do a study and help us dive deeper into the data. And so he took that on, and if we could go to the next slide. So here's some of the data. This is only the tip of the iceberg for the data. It's a 300-page report. Every time I read it, and I've read it multiple times, I'm finding new data in there as well. So just the tip of the iceberg, what he showed was that when you're looking at the calls that come into the Spokane Police Department, we have nearly 3 times as many calls that are indicating an African-American suspect than what their demographics would indicate within the community. When you look at Native Americans, there's 68% more calls coming into the police department from the community than what the Native American demographics would indicate as well. And so what we knew was that the calls coming in from the community related to suspects in crime are not proportional to what the demographics are, and that was an important benchmark. You have a demographic benchmark, and then you also have what Bob Scales calls an activity benchmark. So what he did is he went with an activity level benchmark, which is indicative of what this slide shows. Can you go to the next slide, please? So when you look at the proportion of demographics being called into the police department, what he has found is that the Spokane Police Department is stopping the community across all demographics proportional to what the call or activity-based numbers would indicate. Next slide. And then when you look at, again, the arrests related to the calls that are coming in, broken down, again, by demographics, you're finding that there is not a disparity in the number of arrests, again, based on the calls that are coming in to the police department. And interestingly, what he also found was that if you're African American and you get stopped by the Spokane Police Department, you have a 48% less likely chance of receiving a citation. And if you're Native American, you have a 76% less likely chance of getting a citation from that contact. So in other words, our officers are not stopping community of color and loading them up with tickets. You actually have a higher risk of getting a ticket if you're a white male than you do if you're a community of color. Next slide. And then the use of force. This is something that every police department, every law enforcement agency across the nation struggles with, is disproportionality in uses of force. So this is something that we look at very closely. I believe we had something like 16 uses of force in 2020 with African Americans, about 6 with Native Americans. So what Bob Scalza said is those numbers are very low. 1 or 2 uses of force can sway those figures one way or the other, but despite that, we know this is an area that we have to continue to look at, and we do look at every single use of force. It goes through the chain of command review, and then once a month we have a use of force review board with a cross spectrum of subject matter experts within the department that are also looking at that use of force and finding out, okay, even if this was within policy, what could we have done better? What could we have done different? So we're still looking at that, and we take those figures very serious. And next slide. And then again, when it comes to enforcement, there's no significant racial disparities. You really have to read through this report, and when you release your sheriff as well, you really have to read through the report to see how he compiles the data, how he computes it as well. Because it will, at a minimum, what we're hoping for is it will start a conversation about what does that data mean based on what's coming into our agencies.
And one of the things that, very preliminarily that we've seen is almost a mirror of what your data is. The one thing about use of force that I found interesting, and I haven't really gotten deep into the description of that, is use of force is determined upon the type of issue that we're dealing with, the type of crime. If we're dealing with somebody that's committed a high-level crime, the odds of them fighting with us or having to have use force are higher. Now, if you have a higher demographic committing higher level crimes, your use of force on that demographic is going to be higher, regardless of what you do. And we have such a small population of certain demographics that, like you said, 1 or 2 skews the entire demographics report, if you will. So, folks, we're going to dive into our report. When I'm done reviewing it, we'll come back and we'll give you our report, and then I'd like to maybe have the chief come back and we'll just sit and compare and strategize the next move forward. Folks, I really appreciate the fact that you take the time to listen, and I really appreciate the fact that I know that there will be people out there that are going to reach out and help the chief and I stop our children from dying. That is the goal. The sole goal is we have to stop our kids from dying, and we have to also try to save those who are committing these crimes, or potentially stop the next person from ever committing that type of crime. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. Have a great day.
Here at River Ridge Hardware Garden Center, where we have all the plants and flowers that will spruce up your yard, from the lilacs for Spokane's Lilac City to awesome hanging baskets and pots that you can actually put the hanging baskets in. Here at River Ridge Hardware, we want to help you set up your landscape needs. Neighbors helping neighbors at River Ridge Hardware.
Thanks for watching. Ask the host a question, recommend a guest, or check out any of our other programs on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or SpokaneTalksMedia.com. Sponsored by River Ridge Hardware.